Is this some kind of joke, old-timer? The question, sharp and laced with derision, cut through the humid afternoon air. Corporal Miller, young, cocky, and crisp in his uniform, leaned against the guard shack at the main gate of Fort Hamilton. His mirrored sunglasses hid his eyes but not his contempt. His partner, Private Davies, younger still and eager to impress, snickered beside him. Before them, astride a deep crimson motorcycle that looked as ancient and weathered as he did, sat Stanley Burns. He was 82 years old, a man built of quiet angles and sun-etched lines. His hands, gnarled with age, rested calmly on the handlebars of the vintage Indian chief. He didn't flinch, he didn't scowl. His gaze remained fixed somewhere down the long, heat-shimmered road that led into the heart of the sprawling army base, as if he were looking at a memory only he could see. "License and registration," Miller demanded, his voice impatient. He made a get-to-it gesture with his hand. "And I need you to step off the bike, sir." The "sir" was an insult, a verbal pat on the head for a senile old man playing soldier. Stanley moved with a deliberate slowness that seemed to infuriate the young corporal. He reached into the leather saddlebag, his movements economical and precise, and produced a worn leather wallet. From it he extracted a driver's license and a peculiar-looking identification card. It was an old design, laminated plastic yellowed with age, the photo a ghostly image of a much younger man with flinty eyes. He handed them over. Miller snatched the cards from his hand. He glanced at the driver's license, then let out a short barking laugh as he examined the other ID. "Stanley Burns," he read aloud, turning to Davis. "And what's this supposed to be? Says here you're cleared for." "Well, it doesn't say. Just a bunch of letters and numbers. Looks like something you printed off the internet, Grandpa." Behind Stanley, a line of cars had begun to form. The first driver, a suburban mom in a minivan, honked her horn impatiently. The sound seemed to feed Miller's arrogance. He was the king of this small concrete kingdom, and he was putting on a show. "Sir, I have an appointment," Stanley said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. It was the first time he had spoken. The voice was calm, steady, and held an undercurrent of authority that was entirely at odds with his frail appearance. "An appointment," Miller scoffed, pocketing the IDs. "With who? The base historian?" "Look, I don't have time for this. This isn't a classic bike show. This is a secure military installation. Why don't you turn this museum piece around and go find the nearest bingo hall?" He stepped forward and placed a hand on the gleaming chrome of the Indian's fuel tank, his fingerprints smudging the polished surface. "Bet this thing runs on nostalgia and rust." "Please don't touch my motorcycle," Stanley said. The words were quiet, but the temperature seemed to drop a few degrees. For the first time, a flicker of something hard and dangerous surfaced in his pale blue eyes. Miller saw it, and his ego took it as a challenge. He smirked and gave the handlebars a slight shove, making the heavy bike rock on its stand. "Or what? You gonna tell me some war stories?" The line of cars was longer now. A few people had gotten out, their cell phones raised, recording the confrontation. The scene was becoming a public spectacle. Two uniformed soldiers in their prime, bullying a senior citizen. The injustice of it hung thick in the air. Whispers rippled through the small crowd of onlookers. "I'm going to have to ask you again to get off the bike," Miller said, his voice hardening. He was losing control of the situation and doubling down on his aggression to regain it. "You're causing a disturbance and failing to obey the instructions of a gate sentry. That gives me grounds to detain you." Stanley's eyes drifted from Miller to the small, worn leather pouch tied to his belt. It was a simple, unassuming object. The leather cracked and faded, with a barely visible insignia stamped into its surface. Miller's gaze followed his. "What's in there, your war stories? A bag of old medals you bought at a flea market?" The insult hung in the air, but Stanley's mind was no longer at the gate. For a fleeting second, the image of Corporal Miller was replaced by another young man's face, pale and slick with rain, in a jungle halfway around the world. The humid air of the base gate was suddenly thick with the smell of mud and cordite. A young Stanley, caked in grime, knelt beside a fallen comrade. The boy, barely 20, was pressing a similar leather pouch, new and dark then, into his hand. "Don't let them forget us, Stan," his friend whispered, his voice a wet rattle. "Don't let any of this be for nothing." On the pouch was the insignia of a phantom unit, a special operations group so secret its members were ghosts, their names already stricken from official records. It was the crest of the Ghost Reconnaissance Unit. Back in the present, Stanley's hand instinctively went to the pouch at his belt. A wave of profound sadness washed over his face, a private grief that was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that same unshakable calm. The pouch wasn't a trinket. It was a tombstone for men who never got one. It was a promise he had kept for 60 years. Miller, oblivious, Saw only an old man lost in a daydream. That's it, he declared, reaching for his radio. I'm calling this in. We've got a possible security threat. He decided to run the ID, more for the theatricality of it than anything else. He strode into the guard shack, holding the card up for Davies to see with a theatrical eye roll. Let's see what the system says about our secret agent here. He slid the card into the scanner. In the third car back, Captain Maria Flores gripped her steering wheel, her knuckles white. She was off duty, on her way to the commissary, but she had seen enough. She was a third-generation soldier, and her grandfather had carried himself with that same quiet dignity, that same look of a man who had seen too much and said too little. Everything about this felt wrong. The young corporal's blatant disrespect was an offense to the uniform she wore. When Miller's taunts escalated to physical intimidation and then the baseless accusation of a security threat, she knew she couldn't just sit and watch. Intervening directly would be a mess of jurisdiction and rank-pulling that would only escalate things for the old man. But there were other ways. She pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. She didn't call the base commander or the MPs. That would be too slow, too bureaucratic. She called the one person on the base who could move mountains with a single word. Garrison Command Sergeant Major Evans. He was her former first sergeant, a man who had forgotten more about the army than most generals ever learned. He answered on the second ring. Evans. Sergeant Major, it's Captain Flores. I'm at the main gate. Her voice was low and urgent. The MPs are harassing an elderly veteran. It's making a public spectacle of him, accusing him of having a fake ID, mocking his age, his motorcycle. It's a disgrace. Corporal Miller is about to detain him. What's the man's name? They just ran his ID. I heard Miller say it. Stanley Burns. She spelled it out. B-U-R-N-S. The other end of the line went completely silent for 3 full seconds. When Evans spoke again, his voice was tight with a kind of awed horror that made the hair on Flores's arms stand up. Captain, stay where you are. Do not engage. Do not interfere. Just keep your eyes on Mr. Burns. Is he all right? He's fine. Just calm. But they're about to put hands on him. They won't, Evans said, his voice a low growl of absolute certainty. Flores could hear muffled shouting in the background on his end, a sense of sudden explosive urgency. Get me the general's aide on the line, now, Evans bellowed to someone in his office. Tell him it's a code black. No, I'm not kidding. Just do it. The call ended. Flores lowered her phone, her heart pounding. Code black. She'd never even heard of that designation. It wasn't in any manual she'd ever read. She looked at the old man on the motorcycle, who now seemed to be surrounded by an invisible lethal aura. The balance of power at the gate had just shifted dramatically. Help wasn't just on the way. The entire world was about to turn upside down for Corporal Miller. Inside the Garrison Command building, Command Sergeant Major Evans stood ramrod straight, the phone receiver gripped so tightly in his fist it creaked. His face, usually a stern but fair mask, was now a portrait of disbelief and cold fury. He was already on a second line, connected directly to the office of the base commander, General Thompson. I don't care if he's in a secure video conference with the Joint Chiefs, Evans barked at the general's terrified young aide. You walk into that room, you place a note in front of him, and you do not leave until he reads it. The name is Stanley Burns. He is at the main gate, being unlawfully detained by Corporal Miller and Private Davies. Go now. The scene flashed to General Thompson's stately office. The general, a man whose stern reputation was known throughout the army, was deep in a high-level briefing with Pentagon officials displayed on a large screen. His aide, a young lieutenant, burst through the door, his face ashen. He broke every rule of military protocol, walking directly to the general's desk and placing a small folded note beside his hand. Thompson shot him a look that could curdle milk, but the aide just tapped the note insistently and stepped back. Annoyed, Thompson unfolded it. He read the 2 words written inside. Stanley Burns. The transformation was instantaneous and absolute. General Thompson froze. All the color drained from his face. He stared at the name as if it were a ghost from a forgotten war. The formidable 4-star general on the screen was still talking, but Thompson no longer heard him. He looked up at his aide, his eyes wide with a stunning mixture of shock and something that looked like fear. He leaned into his microphone. This meeting is terminated, he announced, his voice flat and void of all emotion. The officials on the screen began to protest. Thompson cut them off. A national security asset requires my immediate attention. He killed the connection, plunging the room into silence. Then he exploded into action. Get my vehicle, now, he roared at the aide. Scramble the post honor guard. I want a full detail in dress uniform. Alert the provost marshal. Tell him to meet me at the main gate in 5 minutes, and God help anyone who gets in my way. The aide scrambled to execute the orders, the sheer unprecedented urgency of the commands fueling his panic. The name Stanley Burns had just become the most important thing in the world. Back at the gate, Miller was having his moment of triumph. The scanner in the guard shack let out a dismissive beep and flashed a red screen. Invalid credential. No record found. See? Miller said, strutting out of the shack. He held Stanley's ID card between his thumb and forefinger as if it were a piece of trash. Fake. Told you. He flicked the card. It fluttered through the air and landed on the dusty pavement at Stanley's feet. Stanley did not bend to pick it up. He didn't even look at it. His gaze was fixed on Miller, his expression unreadable. This quiet defiance enraged the young corporal. That's it. I've had enough of this charade, Miller declared, his voice rising, playing to the crowd. You are a potential security risk, impersonating whatever it is you think you are. You're being detained for questioning. He unsnapped the retention strap on his holster, a purely theatrical gesture. Get off the bike, hands behind your back, now. Private Davies, who had been watching with growing unease, finally found his voice. Corporal, maybe we should just call the shift sergeant. This is quiet, Private. Miller snapped, high on his own power. He closed the distance and grabbed Stanley's thin, wiry arm. Let's go, old man. The crowd gasped. A line had been crossed. The moment his fingers closed around Stanley's arm, an irreversible chain of events was set in motion. It was then that the sirens started. They were not the familiar whoop of a local police car, but the piercing, multi-toned wail of a full military police escort. From inside the base, 3 black SUVs with flashing lights came screaming down the main road, weaving through traffic with terrifying speed. They screeched to a halt in a perfect tactical formation, their vehicles boxing in the entire scene at the gate. They were followed immediately by 2 armored MP Humvees and a command vehicle, which slammed to a stop behind them. Doors flew open with military precision. A dozen soldiers from the Fort Hamilton Honor Guard, immaculate in their dress blue uniforms with gleaming white gloves and rifles, poured out. They moved with silent, practiced efficiency, forming 2 perfect lines that created a corridor leading from the lead SUV. The provost marshal, a grim-faced lieutenant colonel, leaped from his own vehicle, his eyes already scanning for the threat, but no one was looking at him. All eyes were on the man who emerged from the central black SUV. General Thompson. He stepped out of the vehicle, his face a thundercloud of controlled rage. His eyes swept over the scene. The humiliated old man, the arrogant corporal with his hand still on him, the gawking crowd, and they narrowed into slits of cold fury. Miller and Davies were frozen, their minds unable to process the sheer scale of the response. Miller's hand was still clamped on Stanley's arm, a fact that seemed to burn under the general's gaze. General Thompson strode forward, his polished boots eating up the pavement. He walked past the provost marshal, past the petrified young guards, past the honor guard standing at perfect attention. He ignored Miller as if he were a piece of furniture. His entire focus was on the old man who had now, with a stiff and painful grace, dismounted from his motorcycle. The general stopped precisely 3 feet from Stanley Burns. He drew himself up to his full height, his back going ramrod straight. Then, he snapped the single sharpest, most impeccably respectful salute of his entire decorated career. Mr. Burns, General Thompson's voice boomed, clear and powerful, across the now silent gate area. On behalf of the United States Army, I apologize for the reception you have received at Fort Hamilton. It is an absolute honor to have you here, sir. Stanley looked at the saluting general, the honor guard, the entire chaotic scene that had erupted around him. He gave a slow, tired nod of acknowledgement. It's all right, son, he said, his gravelly voice carrying easily in the stillness. They're just kids. They don't know. The provost marshal stepped forward, holding a tablet computer. At a nod from the general, he began to speak, but Thompson raised a hand, stopping him. The general turned to address the whole assembly, his own men, the stunned onlookers, and most pointedly, the 2 disgraced gate guards. For those of you who do not know, the general began, his voice ringing with authority, the man you see before you is Stanley Burns. The identification card that this corporal, he spat the word like a curse, dismissed as fake, is a Level 1 legacy clearance card. It is a designation that has not been active for 40 years. It bypasses our standard systems because the system itself and most of the people who operate it are not cleared to know who he is. He let the statement hang in the air, the implications sinking in. The crowd was utterly silent, their phones still recording, capturing every historic word. Captain Flores, standing by her car, felt tears welling in her eyes. Mr. Burns, the general continued, his voice resonating with a deep, reverent respect, was a founding member and field operator for the Ghost Reconnaissance Unit during the Cold War. A unit so secret, the United States government denied its very existence until 2015. He operated for years behind the Iron Curtain alone, with no support and no chance of rescue if captured. His actions, documented in files that will remain sealed for another 50 years, single-handedly prevented at least 3 separate incidents that would have led to direct global nuclear war. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Miller's face had gone from pale to a ghastly, bloodless white. He holds the Distinguished Service Cross, 3 silver stars, and a Medal of Honor that was awarded in a classified ceremony by President Kennedy, a medal that officially does not exist. This man is not just a veteran, he is a living legend, he is a national treasure, and he was treated like a common criminal at the gate of a base he indirectly saved from annihilation countless times over. General Thompson's speech finished, and the silence that followed was heavy and profound. Finally, he turned his burning gaze upon Miller and Davies. The full, focused power of his fury was terrible to behold. "Corporal Miller, Private Davies," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "You are a disgrace to that uniform. You are an insult to every soldier who has ever served with honor. You saw an old man, and you saw a target for your pathetic, fragile ego. You did not see the giant on whose shoulders you stand." He turned to the Provost Marshal. "Colonel, take them into custody. I want them brought up on every conceivable charge under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman, even if they aren't officers. Failure to show respect. Dereliction of duty. Find every article that applies. I want them to be an example of what happens when we forget who we are and where we come from." 2 hulking military policemen stepped forward to escort the terrified young guards away. Miller refused to look up, his eyes fixed on the pavement in utter shame. Davies was openly weeping, tears streaming down his face. But as the MPs reached for them, Stanley raised a hand, thin and spotted with age. "General." A word. Thompson's entire demeanor shifted instantly from fury to deference. "Of course, Mr. Burns. Anything." Stanley walked slowly, his old joints protesting, until he stood before the 2 young men. "Son," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle as he addressed Miller. "Pride is a heavy coat. It keeps you warm in the cold, but it will drown you in deep water. You wear your uniform like it's armor to make you feel strong, but the uniform doesn't make the soldier. The heart does. You need to remember that." He then turned his kind, weary eyes to the sobbing Private Davies. "You'll learn," he said softly. "Fear of doing the wrong thing is a better compass than the pride of doing it. Choose the leaders you follow more wisely next time." Finally, he looked back at General Thompson. "Don't ruin their lives, General. They're children. They made a mistake. Teach them. That's the better way. That's the stronger way." General Thompson looked at Stanley, his expression one of pure reverence. His gaze drifted down to the worn leather pouch at Stanley's belt. Is that Captain Albright's pouch, sir?" he asked, his voice suddenly thick with emotion. Stanley touched the pouch. "It is," he confirmed. For a moment the scene at the gate dissolved for the general. He was a young lieutenant again, standing in a dusty command tent in some forgotten conflict zone. A charismatic, brave captain named Albright, the man who would later die in a jungle, pressing this very pouch into Stanley's hand, was briefing him. He had tapped the identical pouch on his own belt. "This holds our luck, Lieutenant," Albright had said with a grin, "and it holds the names of the men who didn't have any. We carry it for them." Back in the present, General Thompson finally understood. It wasn't a good luck charm. It was a memorial, a sacred duty. He looked at Stanley Burns with a new, deeper level of awe. He nodded slowly. "Your wisdom is noted, sir. They will be taught." The story of what happened at the main gate of Fort Hamilton became an instant legend. It spread through the base, then through the digital grapevine to the entire army. General Thompson, true to his word and to Stanley's request, showed a different kind of strength. Corporal Miller and Private Davies were not court-martialed or discharged. Their punishment was far more instructive. They were reassigned to run the base's new Veteran Dignity Initiative. For the next 6 months, their full-time duty was to personally welcome and escort elderly veterans and their families who came to visit the post. They spent their days not checking IDs but listening. They heard stories of Normandy, of Chosin Reservoir, of the Iadrang Valley, of Fallujah. They pushed wheelchairs, carried bags, and sat for hours in the base museum, listening to men who looked just as unassuming as Stanley Burns recount deeds of incredible heroism. They were also tasked with creating a new mandatory training module for all gate security personnel across every branch of the service. It was officially titled Protocols for Dignitary and Veteran Entry, but everyone called it the Burns Protocol. It was a course in de-escalation, observation, and above all, respect. About a month later, Stanley was sitting in his usual booth at a local diner off-post, a simple place with cracked vinyl seats and good coffee. The bell over the door chimed, and in walked Miller, dressed in civilian clothes. He saw Stanley and froze, a look of apprehension on his face. He looked different, humbled, quieter, the arrogant swagger completely gone. Stanley caught his eye and gave a slight nod toward the empty seat across from him. "Sit down, Corporal." Miller hesitated for a moment, then walked over and slid into the booth. He sat in silence, staring at his hands on the tabletop. "Sir," he began, his voice low and choked with sincerity. "I wanted to apologize, for real this time, not because a general told me to." He finally looked up, his eyes filled with a genuine shame that hadn't been there before. "We've been listening to these men. The things they did, the things they saw. I had no idea. I never knew." Stanley took a slow sip of his coffee. He placed the mug down gently. "Now you do," he said, and for the first time a small, genuine smile touched the corners of his lips. "And that's all that matters." They sat together in a comfortable silence, an old hero and a young soldier sharing a coffee as the lesson, truly and deeply, was finally learned. The story of Stanley Burns is a powerful reminder that heroes don't always wear their greatness on their sleeves. If his story of quiet valor moved you, please like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more stories of the unassuming heroes who walk among us.